I wanted to welcome everyone. This is our presentation for Humanities 211 at Warren Pacific. We're talking about Nagasaki and Hiroshima and whether the principles of just and Bello were followed and if it was a justifiable act with using just war principles. This presentation is by Jesse Conley, that's me, Elizabeth Lopez, and Serena Lampkin. So let's start at the beginning. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. So on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese military initiated a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This action was a long time in the making, as Japan had been engaging occupations and attacks against foreign nations like China and Russia for decades. The United States had attempted to stop Japan by imposing economic sanctions, but Japan resisted our attempts. Japan and the U.S. had engaged in negotiations with no success for a lengthy period. The United States was set on stopping Japanese expansion, and Japan needed our Pacific Fleet crippled to allow them to continue their expansion unopposed. With Pearl Harbor gone, Japan controlled the Pacific Ocean. A little bit more context to this is that as Japan had become modernized, they still kept their imperial expansionist views from pre-industrial times. So they'd really been flexing their muscles. They'd beaten Russia, actually, in the Sino-Russian War, and they'd already occupied Manchuria to stop their own economic recession by stealing all their resources. They were hoping to make themselves the great power of the Pacific, and the United States, because we're butting into that territory, we were trying to stop them. So it was kind of a Cold War, if you will. So let's go on to the next slide. The response of the United States. The attack killed almost 2,500 Americans and destroyed 8 naval ships. American outrage was immediate and all-consuming, with President Roosevelt declaring war on Japan the next day. When we declared against Japan, Germany and Italy declared against us as well, so we were left in a very difficult spot of fighting a war we didn't want to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. While we focused initially on the European front, Japan's terror attack was not forgotten, and we engaged in a massive and horrifically violent war against Japan in the Pacific. American forces island hop ever closer to Japan with the intent of invading the Japanese mainland. So basically, when we got dragged in, Churchill and Roosevelt sat down, and Churchill convinced Roosevelt that no, Hitler is the biggest threat right now because he's taking more of European territory than Japan was taking of other territories. And so it was the greater threat. So we had to focus there first. As we were gearing up, we established a base in Australia, getting ourselves ready to get Japan. So it was kind of one of those, like, we didn't forget you. We're coming back for you. But we're going to go focus on this Hitler dude first. So let's go to my next slide. American bombing of Japan. Our attack on the Japanese mainland. We started launching from Saipan, if I remember correctly. It was under the command of General Curtis LeMay. I'm going to go ahead and pause right here. Curtis LeMay was an awful dude. He didn't care how much damage he caused. He was just there to punish the Japanese. Very, very brutal fighter and commander, and he actually led a lot of his own attacks. He employed extremely heavy-handed attacks against Japanese cities, utilizing firebombing runs against the mostly wooden cities in Japan. He realized that I'm just going to take these cities out. They're made out of wood, so let's burn them. We'll just experiment with different things. In one night, he commanded 300 bombers, led by himself, dropping various firebombs on Tokyo and causing 100,000 Japanese citizens to burn in one night. And this was just over a couple hours. I mean, it was a ridiculous bombing run. He continued this tactic and firebombed over 60 Japanese cities, destroying half, 60%, 70% of each of them, destroying the majority of each city with each attack. The smoke and mist from the burning bodies was so great that at times the pilots of the bombers that were 500 feet in the air had to put on their own oxygen masks to keep from gagging on the scent. That's how horrific that those fires were. Let's go to our next slide. So Japan did surrender to this, and so we come to the decision to use atomic weapons. In the middle of 1945, it was apparent that Japan was losing, and America felt pressure to end this campaign quickly. The public was becoming war-weary and impatient for the end of World War II. And the main issue facing the American military was that our experience fighting the Japanese to that point We knew that Japan wouldn't surrender an inch of their homeland without a horrific price paid by American soldiers. Some estimates put the American casualties between 1.7 and 4 million casualties, so that's injured and dead, with over 500,000 U.S. deaths. And that was gauged between 400,000 and 800,000 were their estimates, and up to 10 million Japanese deaths, soldiers and civilians combined. U.S. leadership knew that this cost was too high to pay for the Americans to accept, so they needed a way to force the surrender of Japan, but were stumped as the horrific firebombing hadn't gotten Japan to the negotiating table. They were still very defiant. When President Truman took office, he learned of the Manhattan Project, which was run by Robert Oppenheimer, and atomic weapons. He found out about this whole secret project that no one else knew about, and knew that they could end the war in Japan before an invasion became necessary. Now, they, at that point, had only done a test run. They weren't even 100% certain on the delivery system. They figured the gun mechanism was the thing that would work best for them, but they weren't even sure if it would work. And so they just took all of the material they had. It was enough to make Little Boy, and they shot it out so they could be used in the Pacific. So it was really kind of a last-ditch thing. So now we come to using the bombs.
Go.
All right, so now we come to using the atomic bombs. So August 6, 1945 saw a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay drop an atomic bomb named Little Boy on Hiroshima early in the morning. I believe it was about 8:15 or 8:29 in the morning, something like that. The bomb exploded about 2,000 feet above the city and destroyed 5 square miles of the city, causing around 80,000 deaths instantly and many more lost to radiation poisoning immediately after. Japan was still going to try and still initially refused to surrender, so 3 days later an American bomber named Boxcar took off and was originally going to bomb the city Kokura, but weather, high fog and things like that forced the bomber to reroute to Nagasaki. This bomb was called Fat Man. It was actually much bigger than the first, but with the topography around the city, it was inside narrow valleys, but the land around Nagasaki prevented the same destruction. Only 2.5 square miles of city was destroyed and 40,000 deaths caused, which is weird to say only, but for a much bigger bomb to have half the effect. On August 15th, the Emperor of Japan finally surrendered to these attacks. He surrendered at noon. Not counting the deaths during the island hopping campaign, there were less than 200,000 immediate deaths from the decision to use the bombs instead of the almost 14 million estimated casualties predicted from the invasion. So thank you for listening to my section of this, and we'll go to Serena next.
Hi, so I'm Serena, and I'll be talking about the Justin Bello principles and if we followed them when we dropped the bombs. So Justin Bello is actually Latin for law in war. And these Justin Bello are principles that are set forth to determine which actions are legal in wartime. This is also known as international humanitarian law. Justin Bello seeks to reduce civilian suffering and governs actions in combat. Now, this is completely independent of jus ad bellum, which centers on justifying going to war in the first place. Justin Bello highlights the need to limit civilian deaths and suffering and to keep soldiers and officers in line while fighting. Historically, combatants have been known to be violent and deadly to civilians of their opponents. So specific international principles are needed to keep this violence to a minimum and to identify who the targets should be. This centers on 2 principles: discrimination and proportionality. So discrimination. Morally, and this is centered on morally, we cannot deliberately target or kill innocents or civilians, which has been known to happen. The principle of discrimination is to help distinguish who these innocents are, and they're known as non-combatants. Non-combatants are innocent in this context because they are not able to cause harm, willfully or not, to opposing military forces. Walzer claims that civilians are innocent and still have the right to live. The discrimination principle outlines that these non-combatants are not to be harmed intentionally. Non-combatants include children, the elderly, any hospital patients or anyone who is ill, any factory or industrial worker producing products that are not related to war purposes, prisoners of war, and any civilian who does not pose a threat, either intentional or intentional. Now, combatants. These are the ones who can purposefully be attacked. These are legitimate targets and include military and government leaders, soldiers, any civilians who were employed by the military, and workers who help produce products that are used in war. In fact, Walzer claims that any combatant has lost their right to life and liberty, which is very controversial. The other principle of Jus in Bello is proportionality. This states any harm done must be proportionate to the military advantages that are achieved. Before any action is taken, leaders and soldiers must weigh the benefits of the action with the amount of harm that will be caused by it. This is particularly true when soldiers make decisions during combat. Is it worth it to target a low-ranking soldier when it wouldn't harm many civilians? What are the benefits in that situation? How much harm will be caused? If the target is a high-ranking officer, are the same decisions to be made? These are decisions that must be made when using proportionality. Now, proportionality does allow the harm of non-combatants if the military advantage is great enough, and that is what was centered on when dropping the bombs. So, did they follow Jus in Bello principles? The bombings have been hotly debated for years. Did the decision really follow international humanitarian law? Did it meet both proportionality and discrimination standards? If we look at the bombing with the discrimination lens, Hiroshima was chosen as the site for the first bomb because there were factories and other military facilities. However, there were other remote military targets that could have been chosen, such as Tokyo Beach. This could have greatly reduced civilian and non-combatant casualties. However, Truman and U.S. officials wanted to show Japan just how powerful and destructive their new weapon was in order to force a surrender. When no surrender was offered, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. As Jesse stated, initially the bomb was meant for Kokura, but on the morning of August 9th, 1945, there was too much haze and smoke around Kokura, and Nagasaki was chosen as the alternative target. Here we have the morality and casualty curve that Truman and his advisors used when deciding where the bomb should be dropped. Here you'll see the curve. So proportionality can be a difficult principle of Jus in Bello. What is proportional for those in power may devastate those who fall victim to proportionality. Now, this will likely still be debated for countless years to come, but from a U.S. standpoint, it was proportional to bomb Japan both times. Truman and his advisors estimated that a land invasion of the island of Japan would cost approximately 400,000 U.S. lives, and even more Japanese civilian lives would inevitably die if they attempted a land invasion. By that logic, the bombing was certainly proportional. The Truman administration used the casualty curve, which I just showed, to model how many citizens were in a city in Japan at any given time. This also identified a morality curve, which they used to determine proportionality. However, many criticized this logic and claim that the numbers are way off, and many more citizens died after the initial blasts. Truman and U.S. advisors were mostly concerned with saving American lives. Who could blame them after so many years and so much bloodshed? We not only count those who died in the initial blasts of the bombs, but we must count those who perished after prolonged suffering of radiation poisoning. And this also does not include those who have since died from radiation-induced cancers. We're still dealing with this today. The estimated death tolls at Hiroshima as of mid-November 1945 was 64,500, and 72,000 more were injured. The estimated death tolls at Nagasaki as of mid-November 1945 were 39,214 and 25,153 were injured. Truman and U.S. advisors set out to end the war, and this achieved those results. Japan gave their unconditional surrender, and the war was over. The effects of radiation, however, were far from over. And now we have Liz, who will discuss the effects of that radiation.
Okay, thanks, Serena. So, the effects. So, a quote that I took from CDC says it's all about the dose. So, the higher the dose you get of the radiation is worse and faster that it affects the person. So, for example, you get shot with a whole bunch of radiation, the impact is a lot quicker, a lot worse than if you were to get little bits of radiation at a time. So when I think about that, it's like X-rays and things like that, right? So that's every so often, not frequent, which the effects from that is very minimal to nothing. So, which is why we still do all that stuff. But the other thing is the distance. Distance also makes a difference. So, how far were you from the radiation, the impact, and all that that your body's going to absorb? Was the person covered behind something? Was it something that was just, just took them out completely and just vaporized them? Or where was this person kind of standing and how close? So, like I said, the more radiation at once, the worse it is, and the less longer periods is, it's less effect to the body. Let's go to the next one, please. So comparing, this I really liked because it says, so people within 900 meters received about 2 grades of radiation. And just so that you guys have an idea of what that means, 0.75 grays is, it's about 18,000 chest x-rays. Now think about this going all over your body at once versus just, when you get an x-ray, you're thinking, I hurt my ankle. I'm just taking an image on that one spot, right? Versus a lot more images in one area, and this would be completely just all over your body. So that was a comparison that I really liked, because then it makes you feel like you can actually relate compared to, that's a lot, 18,000 at once all over your body. It's a ton. Next one, Selena. Thank you. So radiation effects on the body. I was looking into this a little bit more, but this is kind of a good idea. So it affects all your body, right? From your hair, and it depends on, again, how much you get. So it's hair, you lose hair with about 200 rems or higher. The brain is affected, so the brain cells don't like regenerate and stuff too. So that one, they say that if it's cells that kind of keep producing, then you affect those cells with less radiation, so it's quicker to be affected. So like the brain, they don't reproduce, so they need more REMs. So this one's 5,000 REMs or higher to be affected a little bit more, or a little quicker, I guess I should say. And then the bloodstream, so 100 REMs, which the lymphocytes will decrease a lot faster, so it's a lot more susceptible to infection once those cells are affected, which means that it's harder for us to fight infections once all that is affected, which leads to more deaths because you're a lot more prone to getting infections and harder for your body to fight it. Your heart, so 1,000 to 5,000 REMs can cause heart failure and death. So along with just the radiation itself, the impact on the body, the radiation would throw off burns. You'd burn, right? If depending on how far, if it wasn't a death, you'd get, burns and scarring, all of that stuff. And so if you weren't burned or anything like that, kind of like the superficial side, the heart would be affected and could cause death from the heart failure. It does affect the GI tract as well. I mean, all over the body, 200 rems or more damage to the intestinal lining. This can cause the symptoms of flu, like flu-like symptoms, right? Nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, things like that. Reproductive tract, it said 200 or lower. And longer term too, you can people can become sterile, right? Even if I don't know if you guys heard, but when you're trying to conceive, some doctors will say, or a lot of doctors will say, that you can't even have like a laptop on your lap, right? Because this affects it. So now imagine all this radiation being shot at you at one time. People could become sterile. Now that's not 100%, right? But it does happen. So just a little background. One of my sister had radiation treatment. She had a brain tumor. She had radiation treatment, and this was just localized, right, to that spot in that brain. But she was told that she may not even be able to have children. She was 17. So the younger you are, the more it affects you, right, and longer term. So so she was told, oh, you might not even be able to have kids. And this is like medical treatment. So I'm thinking, okay, now all over your body, who knows what else will be affected, right? But it's a sure thing. Next slide. Thank you. So radiation symptoms. So again, the closer you are, it's either instant death or you get all these other early symptoms. Some people, within, if they didn't pass away instantly, within days, weeks, months, their body was affected. So it was like a longer drawn out versus just an instant death. I was reading in some articles and they were saying, well, why? Maybe it's, it'd be painful, more painful death, right? So your body is going through, again, like early signs of radiation effects would be like flu symptoms. So imagine feeling sick for days, weeks, months until you pass away. So, and a lot of these things, I mean, you wouldn't really be able to tell unless you have a blood count done. But at that point, I mean, they're going through war. How many places were actually available to give treatment, right? So there's that. Now, I did find a story on a few stories actually, but one of them kind of really caught my eye. It's Ida's story. He lost his family at 3 years old. So he lost his dad during the war. Oh, sorry, Serena, can you switch the page? He lost his dad during the war, and he was 3 years old. And then shortly after, after the bombing, he lost his mom and siblings. And he thought, later as a kid, he thought, well, we'll be reunited later. Turns out that they passed away. He was injured, bedridden for years, then had debilitating illnesses since then. He ended up with anemia. He ended up with ulcers. He had surgeries. He had 2 surgeries to remove brain tumors. And then lastly, he also had a thyroid growth. So he's been going through all this since then. He was a 3-year-old, lost his family, lost everything, and still ends up dealing with all this aftermath that he's affected by. So not only short term but long term, that it just kind of keeps going and keeps going. And then I was looking into this a little bit more, and it looks like we have a research center, like a radiation research center, right? The after effects, and there's a lot of controversy about who should U.S. Pay for their health symptoms, aftermath, things like that. And they don't really go into that much, but they don't want to, because then that's pretty much admitting to fault, right? And so they're kind of left by themselves because their country doesn't really do it, especially the second generations. and then we don't really want to take responsibility for it as well. So they're kind of just left with all this aftermath that really comes along with war, right? Next slide, please. Okay, so who is affected most? As I kept looking into this, women are affected the more than men. Not saying men aren't at all, but stats show that women are affected most, and then children are, or I'm sorry, women are affected more than men, but children are affected the most. So they found a lot of children after the bombing that were coming up with leukemia. Years after, so on and so forth. Women, a lot of breast cancer was coming up from that. Along with genetics and all that, of course, they were looking into what's handed down, what's changed genetics, so on and so forth. Which was interesting to me, women at age of menstruation were at higher risk of developing breast and or uterine cancer later in life than other exposed to, before or after puberty. So right in that initial moment, if you were, affected by this, there was a lot more coming out than just short term. So they were also looking into the fact that if you get this radiation dose within years, it's kind of starts clearing out of your system, kind of like a toxin or a medicine, keeps clearing out. But sounds like these, some of these cancers were just kind of carrying on, and a lot more we've been seeing too. So the last slide here is just showing that of the women having a higher risk. So it's just a graph here that you guys can take a look at. And then lastly, I have a YouTube video, so if you guys have a chance to take a look at it, it just kind of gives you a visual of bomb dropped and the blast and everything. But thank you guys for looking at our video.
All right, that concludes the presentation. Thank you all for listening.